Hi, I'm Ann Krisnick, the Executive Director of the JRLC, and this is our first legislative update video of the 2020 session. So the session began on February 11th. There have been lots of things happening at the Capitol. That doesn't necessarily mean that we'll have lots of things accomplished at the end of the session. As most of you know, this is a campaign year, and so all the senators and all the representatives are up for re-election. And I think that will result in a number of things maybe getting heard, maybe not even getting heard, but people being reluctant to take votes on some issues that they don't want to be part of the campaign discussion. But we'll talk a little bit about the things that we're working on, but first kind of an overview of what this year's session is about. The state of Minnesota operates on a 2-year budget cycle, so unlike our budget here or someone's budget at home, we don't get to continue to run deficit spending. We have to make sure that the amount of money that we're getting in will support the amount of money that we spend. And so the state does that on a 2-year basis. Last year, the 2019 legislature set the budget for the following 2 years, for the year beginning in July of last year and then the year beginning in July of this year. So that's when they figure out how much money they're getting in. They work on the tax bill and figure out all the pieces for that and look at how much money they're spending. So each of the departments has a budget for the next 2 years, and any special projects and all those things were taken care of last year. In the second year, the state theoretically, doesn't always work this way, but then the state focuses on a few different things. The biggest one is bonding. So the state looks at what kind of capital improvement projects do we need around the state, what kinds of things do we need to build or repair or rehabilitate. So that might be roads and bridges, that might be building new schools. We're hopeful that it includes a lot of money for housing. I'll talk about that in a minute. And also making sure that we're protecting the investment on those capital projects that we already have. The second thing that they look to is policy bills. So during the time when they're doing budget decisions, there isn't as much time necessarily to debate some of the policy issues. And so you'll see policy bills discussed in that second year that don't have significant financial implications. The third thing that actually is going to work out better this year than it could is to say, how did we do on our budget? And so if the state is running behind what they expected to take in, they need to look at some reductions in order to have a balanced budget for the following year, the second year of the biennium. Or if they're running ahead, then they have what they would call a supplemental budget. And the state just released today its budget forecast, and it's expected that the state will have a surplus of $1.5 billion, and that's a bit higher than people were expecting, so that's good news. It's not a huge amount of money, and of course we want to make sure that we're making efforts to have a healthy reserve, so some will likely go into the reserve, and then we look at what happens with the rest. So I'll come back to that budgeting process in a minute. But that's kind of an overview of where we are. The legislature needs to complete its work by May 18th, and if they don't, then the governor would need to call a special session. So when we look at the JRLC legislative agenda, the biggest issue we're working on is housing, and that's a bonding year, and we really need to build this infrastructure around the state, both for affordable housing, for mid and low income Minnesotans. We need to make sure some of that is supportive housing for people who have mental health, addiction, other needs. There's a real lack of affordable housing statewide in every community. And the other thing we need to address is emergency shelter. So there are many places in the state where there's no emergency shelter available at all. Pretty much in every community you're going to find real lack of emergency shelter for youth, for families, and for seniors. And so we're part of the Homes for All Coalition, which is over 200 groups across the state working on housing issues, working on bonding. The ask for the Home for All Coalition is $500 million. Some of that is to rehabilitate existing structures, bring them up to code. Some of that is for emergency shelters, some of it's for affordable housing. So you'll be hearing more from that as you get our email blasts and kind of find out what we're working on. But on that issue, last week was a big hearing in the House Housing Committee. It's actually a division, but the Housing, Finance, and Policy Division over in the House of Representatives had its big hearing on what to do about housing, and that $500 million bill was introduced. A copy of that presentation, the PowerPoint for it, will be on our webpage either by the end of tonight or by tomorrow, so you can see. It's the beginning slide is Homes for All, and so That's a group made up of advocacy groups like us, service organizations, nonprofit developers, for-profit developers looking at housing issues, so you can see that. So that has started to move along and it's in play. It's clear from both the Senate and the House, Democrats and Republicans, we need to have a bonding bill. And then the questions are really, number one, how much is that going to be? Minnesota has the highest bond rating, so we have a really good credit rating, and are in a position to make some significant purchases of bonds to do funding for projects. But how much are we going to borrow, and then how is that going to be distributed? How much is for the various different things we use that for? So that's kind of the housing piece. The other big thing that a lot's been happening on is early childhood. So the JRLC, along with a number of other groups, has been working on child care assistance for years. Those of you that helped us last year as advocates, thank you for your work. And you may recall that we got some changes made in the law that really help families experiencing homelessness. They no longer immediately lose access to child care when they no longer are working or in school. So that creates a wonderful sense of stability for kids when they're really in crisis and don't have much stability in their lives, but also allow those parents to go out and look for work or be looking for a program. They also shorten the amount of time that those applications from families experiencing homelessness will need to be processed, because 30 days is a really long time. And so that was shortened to 5 days. But we still have two huge problems around the child care assistance program. The first is that there are a number of families, about 1,700 families, that are eligible for assistance and are currently on a waiting list. So they have jobs lined up or they'd like to go into a program, but there aren't spots available for them. The other is that the reimbursement rate for people providing that care has dropped significantly since 2003. So we are continuing to make efforts to address that. It was at the 75th percentile. Now it's at the 25th percentile based on a very old, outdated study of what child care rates are in different communities. The biggest focus that we're having in this year, where it's not a big funding year, is that there are about $60 million in the federal government that we are in danger of losing because we're out of compliance in terms of making progress with the provider rates for those people that are providing that service. So we're part of a coalition, Kids Can't Wait, you've probably seen that on our literature, that's really working to, number one, make sure that we meet those minimal federal requirements and get us into compliance, but also to use some of that federal money on one-time expenditures. We realize that that's not recurring money, but what can we do to really start addressing this child care crisis? And there have been a number of hearings on that, and the Early Childhood Committee finished up its testimony on that particular piece last week, and the JRLC testified, a number of other groups were there. So those are the issues that we've had hearings on, and there are a number that we haven't. So I'm going to talk about a number of those. We're working with MICA, which is the Metropolitan Interfaith Council on Affordable Housing, a metropolitan group, on a lead issue. There are children throughout the state that are poisoned in their homes because their homes were built before 1978, when lead paint was used pretty much everywhere. So last year, or actually the most recent year is 2018, 885 children were newly diagnosed with dangerously high elevated blood levels of lead. And that results in permanent brain damage. It affects learning and behavior and speech and hearing. And we need to start making some efforts to address that. So the bill that we're supporting is $1 million, half of it to be spent in the rural parts of Minnesota and half of it to be spent in an urban area to encapsulate the paint. So there's some federal funds that the state received that can be used to replace windows, and whenever we can, we want to couple with those, but really just to have a first step and start addressing some of these homes to have children be safe. We know that hand to mouth that kids do all the time, you're not going to stop that. And so if they live in somewhere that's dangerous, we need to really be starting to address that. So working on finalizing authors for that. A couple of you, maybe more than a couple of you, people in a couple of districts have gotten emails from us directly saying, please contact your legislator about either signing on to the bill or really pushing to have a hearing on that. So we'll be continuing to work on that issue. Fees and fines is something you've heard about for years if you're not a new JRLC member. Really addressing the impact of, if I get a traffic fine and I can't pay it, what does that do? My license gets suspended, that triggers all kinds of things. There's some ability to waive a portion of that fear fine, but not the major portion of it, so we're continuing to work on that. That passed in the House last year, so our focus is really on the Senate this year and making sure that we can get that to hearing and build support so we can move at least one of those two bills forward, so we're working on that. A new issue for us this year is addressing the real challenges of maternal mortality. There are 3 countries in the world where the rates of maternal mortality are rising: Sudan, Afghanistan, and the United States. And that is shameful. If you're a person of color, the likelihood that you die in childbirth is significantly higher, 3 to 4 times higher. If you're a Native or Indigenous woman, it's 10 times higher than it would be for the average in Minnesota. And we need to address those issues. So Minnesota currently studies maternal deaths and tries to look at what patterns or what things they could do to change to make that less common. And we had a bill, not our bill, it came to us from the United Methodist Women, to really look at expanding that to look at morbidity cases where there is a serious medical condition, a seizure, a stroke, significant loss of blood, a need to be admitted to the ICU. So you'd be looking at those cases that were close calls but had a favorable outcome instead of only looking at those cases where the woman did not survive. And in looking at that and working with them on that bill, realized that there are a significant number of women that are on Medicaid, so this would be primarily low-income women, women of color, whose data is not being reviewed and reported and assessed because there's not a data sharing ability between the Department of Health and the Department of Human Services. So we're looking at addressing that as well. We want to make sure that we're getting data from the most vulnerable populations because that's where we can make the most difference. So we're working on that bill. There haven't been bias crimes bills introduced yet that we'll be working on, but as they do, you'll continue to hear about that. You'll be hearing from us on gun safety, and we'll be working to support the bills that want to close that loophole that between private sellers, a private buyer and seller, you can sell a gun, transfer ownership without the need for a background check. And there are exceptions for things like a family member giving it to a son or a daughter or something. So we'd be working on those issues as well. So that's kind of a quick overview of what we're working on. Big issue at the Capitol is going to be what do we do with the surplus? With the Republicans saying we really need to be looking at, can we reduce taxes? This money should be going back to the people who helped fund that surplus, and most of the discussion around that is going to be around taxing Social Security. So Minnesota is in the minority that Social Security income for seniors is taxed in Minnesota, it's taxable, and so there's a lot of discussion around that. On the Democrat side, really pushing that some of that money should be spent to address early childhood, child care assistance, some of those